Welcome to Life Stories, where the most unexpected encounters lead to the most unforgettable journeys. On a freezing winter night, deep in the Wyoming wilderness, a lone man hears a strange sound outside his cabin. When he opens the door, he doesn't find a lost traveler or a stray animal, he finds a bear, battered by the storm, frost clinging to its fur, desperation in its eyes. What happens next is a story of trust, survival, and an extraordinary bond between man and beast. Subscribe to Life Stories to begin today's journey. Let's dive into the story. Winter had a way of swallowing sound, of turning the world into a vast, frozen expanse where even the wind seemed hesitant to break the silence. It was the kind of night that made a man feel utterly alone, where the walls of a cabin weren't just wooden planks but a barrier between the living and the endless. Indifferent wild. I had lived here, deep in the Wyoming wilderness, for nearly 2 years. By choice. The weight of the past pressed down on me in ways I could no longer carry. So I had retreated here, into the arms of the mountains. There was something strangely comforting about the solitude, at least. That's what I had told myself. Most nights, I sat by the fire, my old Nikon resting on the table beside me, capturing the world through a lens rather than living it. The stars, the elk grazing at dawn, the frozen lake that stretched beyond my porch, they were beautiful. But they were distant. That night, as the fire crackled softly in the wood stove, I sat with a book in my lap, barely reading. Outside, the storm raged on, snow whirling in chaotic flurries against the windowpane. Then, I heard it. A sound. It wasn't the howl of the wind or the creaking of trees bending under ice. It was low, guttural, almost a whimper. A sound of pain, of something suffering. My first thought was a coyote, maybe a wolf injured in the storm. But then I heard it again. Closer this time. A deep and primal sound that sent a shiver through me. I stood up, my pulse quickening, and moved toward the window. The glass was fogged from the warmth of the cabin, and for a moment, all I could see was my own reflection. Tired and hollow-eyed, I wiped the condensation away and peered out into the swirling white. At first, there was nothing, just snow and shadows. But then a shape, a dark, massive form hunched low near the edge of the porch. My breath caught. A bear. Even in the dead of winter, even with the knowledge that grizzlies should be hibernating, my instincts flared with caution. A bear was always a danger, especially one desperate enough to approach a human dwelling. My fingers hovered over the door latch. Every part of me screamed to lock it, to let nature take its course. But then I saw its eyes. Amber pools, glassy and weary. There was no aggression in them. No wild rage. Only exhaustion. And something else, something I couldn't name. I hesitated. My breath came in short, measured gasps. This wasn't just any bear. It was injured. Its fur was thick with ice. Its breathing labored. Its front paw pressed awkwardly into the snow. What would you do if a creature of the wild turned to you for help? That thought sliced through my fear. I had spent so long running from the world, locking myself away in this cabin, convinced that I had nothing left to give. And yet, here was this massive, powerful beast, looking at me not as prey, not as a threat, but as something else entirely. I opened the door, just a crack. The wind rushed in, sharp and unforgiving. The bear barely reacted, only shifting slightly, its wounded paw trembling as it tried to stay upright. Jesus, I muttered under my breath. The rational part of me knew I was inviting trouble. A grizzly, even a weakened one, was still a predator. One swipe of its paw, and I'd be nothing but a memory. But another part of me, a part one had buried for a long time, overpowered the fear. The part that still believed in compassion. I grabbed a thick wool blanket from the chair, hesitated only a second longer, then stepped onto the porch. My boots crunched in the snow, the cold biting through my layers. The bear flinched slightly but didn't back away. Up close. It was worse than I had thought. Its ribs pressed against its thick fur. Its breath came in shallow puffs of steam. And the gash on its paw was raw and blackening at the edges, frostbite. "You poor thing," I murmured. My voice cracked. I extended the blanket slowly, draping it over its massive shoulders. The bear didn't resist. It shivered at the warmth but remained still, as if surrendering to whatever fate I decided for it. For a long moment, we stood there, man and beast, caught in some strange, fragile understanding. Then, step by slow step, I led it inside. The heat from the stove hit the bear immediately, and it let out a deep, weary exhale. Then, with a heavy thud, it collapsed onto the wooden floor. I stood frozen, gripping the edge of the table for support. A grizzly, was lying in my cabin, mere feet away. And yet, I felt no fear, only an overwhelming, aching sense of pity. The moment the bear collapsed onto the cabin floor, I felt the weight of my decision settle over me. The fire flickered, casting warm golden light across its massive form, highlighting every ridge of its ribs beneath matted fur. It was vulnerable in a way I had never imagined a grizzly could be. I exhaled, long and slow, and moved cautiously, my every step deliberate. The bear's breathing was labored, heavy, as if every breath was a struggle. Its injured paw was stretched out in front of it, a stark contrast against the dark wooden planks. I had been alone for so long. And now, for the first time in years, I wasn't. I crouched a few feet away, still unsure if this was insanity or something else entirely. The rational part of me was screaming, "This is a wild animal. This is dangerous. Get out." But another part, quieter, but more insistent, whispered something different. "It came to you for help." I moved to the cabinet and retrieved my first aid kit. It wasn't much. Some antiseptic wipes, gauze, a small tube of antibiotic ointment. Nothing meant for treating a creature this size. But I had to try. My hands shook as I approached. Kneeling down beside the bear, I hesitated, reaching out only to have the bear flinch at my touch. Its muscles tensed. And for a second, I thought I had pushed too far, that it would lash out. Instead, it let out a deep, tired sigh and went still again. I know, I murmured, as if speaking to a wounded dog. My voice was softer than I expected, full of something I hadn't felt in a long time, concern. "Just hold on. All right." The wound on its paw was deep. The edges were blackening from frostbite, the flesh raw and cracked. I swallowed hard and reached for the antiseptic wipe. The moment the cold wipe touched the wound, the bear let out a deep, rumbling growl, not aggressive, but a warning. I pulled back immediately, heart pounding. "Easy," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the crackle of the fire. "I'm just trying to help." For a long moment, nothing happened. The bear's amber eyes locked onto mine, and I could feel the tension thick between us. An invisible thread stretched too tight. Then, it exhaled again and lowered its head to the floor. Trust. Or at least, something close to it. I worked quickly, wiping away the dirt and ice, my hands trembling with every movement. The wound was bad, but not beyond saving. I spread the ointment over it as gently as I could, then wrapped it in gauze. "There," I said, sitting back on my heels. "Not perfect, but it'll do." The bear shifted slightly, testing the weight on its paw, then let out a low sound, a grumble of discomfort. But not aggression. I moved back, giving it space. My eyes drifted to the jar of honey on the shelf. Real Montana clover honey. I had bought it from a roadside stand months ago and barely touched it. I hesitated, then grabbed the jar, unscrewed the lid, and set it on the floor a few feet away. The bear's nose twitched. A slow, tentative movement. And then, to my utter astonishment, it stretched its thick neck forward and licked at the honey. its tongue curling around the rim of the jar. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "That's it," I murmured. More to myself than to the bear. "You're gonna be all right. We'll figure this out." I leaned back against the wall, exhaustion creeping in. But for the first time in years. It wasn't the kind of exhaustion that came from emptiness. It was the kind that came from having someone, to care for. The morning came slowly, creeping into the cabin through the frost-rimmed windows. I hadn't truly slept. Only drifted in and out. My senses always tuned to the steady rhythm of the bear's breathing. The warmth of the fire had softened the sharp chill in the air, but it hadn't melted the uncertainty that settled deep in my bones. The bear stirred before I did, shifting its weight with a low, gravelly exhale. I sat up in my chair, rubbing the stiffness from my neck as I watched it. Its injured paw was still wrapped in gauze, and though it moved gingerly, it was moving. That alone gave me some relief. "Hey there," I murmured, my voice rough with sleep. The bear blinked, its amber eyes sharper now, more alert. It wasn't the same creature that had collapsed on my floor the night before. It had regained some strength, enough to push itself up onto its front paws, testing its balance. Then, something strange happened. It turned its head toward the door. At first, I thought nothing of it. Just the natural curiosity of an animal in an unfamiliar space. But then, it did it again. Slowly, deliberately. It sniffed the air, ears twitching, body tense. I frowned. "What is it?" I asked. As if the bear could answer me. It shifted its weight, dragging its injured paw slightly as it tried to stand fully. The pain made it falter, but its determination didn't waver. It took a single, slow step toward the door, then paused, turning back to look at me. And I swear, there was something in that gaze that sent a chill through me. A plea. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. "You want me to follow you, don't you?" The bear let out a low huff. Something between a growl and a sigh. It wasn't aggressive. Wasn't warning me. If anything, it felt like insistence. A request. I ran a hand over my face. This was madness. I had already done something reckless by letting a grizzly into my home. Now, I was contemplating stepping out into the wilderness, in the dead of winter, to follow it to God knows where. But the thought of saying no, of ignoring whatever had driven this bear to my doorstep in the first place, felt impossible. I sighed. "All right," I muttered, pulling on my heavy coat and boots. "But if you're leading me to some trap, I swear I'll haunt you in the afterlife." The bear didn't react. Of course. It simply turned back toward the door, waiting. The air outside was brutal. The kind of cold that gnawed at exposed skin within seconds. Snow crunched beneath my boots as I stepped out, pulling my coat tighter around me. The bear moved with slow but steady steps, leading me away from the cabin, its injured paw dragging slightly with each movement. I followed at a cautious distance, my heart pounding harder with each step. The landscape stretched out before us in eerie silence, the trees towering like frozen sentinels in the pale morning light. The bear didn't hesitate, it knew exactly where it was going. A ridge loomed ahead, the terrain sloping steeply downward into a narrow ravine. The bear reached the edge and paused, sniffing the air again. My pulse quickened. And then I saw it. Tracks. Fresh in the snow. Smaller. Delicate. Not human. My breath caught. I turned back to the bear, and for the first time, I understood. It wasn't just seeking help for itself. It was leading me to something or someone else. For a long moment, I just stood there, the cold seeping through my coat, my breath rising in white clouds. My mind struggled to process what I was seeing. The tracks in the snow were small, delicate, a cub's. I turned to the bear, my pulse thudding in my ears. "You have cubs," I murmured. The words barely made it past my lips, but the realization struck me like a physical blow. The bear's amber eyes met mine, and for the first time, I understood the full weight of what had happened. It hadn't come to me just for itself. It had come because something even more vulnerable needed saving. My gaze followed the tracks leading down into the ravine, where the snow was deeper, untouched except for the trail vanishing into the tree line. I swallowed hard. If the cubs were down there alone, they wouldn't survive. The mother bear moved forward, her injured paw trembling as she tried to descend. But the incline was steep, treacherous. She faltered, letting out a low, exhausted sound somewhere between frustration and pain. She couldn't make it down. I looked back toward my cabin, just barely visible in the distance. I could turn back, leave this to nature. The law of the wild was harsh, and I had lived here long enough to know that survival wasn't guaranteed to anyone, not man, not beast. But then I thought of what it meant to lose family. I knew that pain too well. I gritted my teeth and took my first step down. The snow was deep, my boots sinking with every movement. But I pushed forward, gripping low-hanging branches for support. My breath came in short, sharp bursts. But I didn't stop. When I reached the bottom of the ravine, my chest tightened at the sight before me. 2 cubs, barely more than small bundles of fur, were huddled together near the base of a rock outcrop, their tiny bodies trembling, their eyes half-lidded with exhaustion. They were so small, so fragile. God, I whispered, my heart twisting. They barely reacted to my voice. They were too weak, too cold. If I didn't act now, they wouldn't last another night. I moved carefully, not wanting to startle them. When I crouched down, one of the cubs let out a faint, pitiful whimper, its breath visible in the frigid air. The other barely moved at all. I hesitated only for a second before reaching out, my gloved hands wrapping gently around the first cub. It was cold, too cold. Its tiny paws twitched weakly as I lifted it against my chest, tucking it beneath my coat. The second cub stirred slightly, making a weak attempt to curl closer to its sibling. My throat tightened as I gathered it up, cradling it carefully. "You're okay," I murmured, my breath warming the top of their heads. "I've got you." The climb back up was slow, my body protesting under the weight of both the cubs and the sheer exhaustion clawing at my limbs. But I didn't stop. When I finally reached the top, the mother bear was waiting. She let out a deep, guttural sound when she saw them, her injured paw shifting forward. Relief. Recognition. I moved toward her, every instinct telling me that this was a moment that could go wrong in an instant. But she didn't lash out. She didn't growl. She simply watched as I held out her cubs. For the first time in a long while, something deep inside me, a part of myself I had long thought lost, stirred back to life. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was saving something. And in doing so, maybe I was saving myself, too. The journey back to the cabin was slow, each step deliberate. The wind had picked up again, cutting through my coat like a knife. But I barely felt it. My arms were wrapped tightly around the cubs, their small bodies trembling against my chest, their tiny breaths warm against my skin. Behind me, the mother bear followed, her injured paw dragging slightly with each step. But she didn't stop. She had trusted me. And now, I was trusting her. By the time we reached the cabin, the sky had begun to darken, streaked with the soft hues of twilight. My breath came in sharp bursts as I pushed open the door and stepped inside, the warmth of the fire hitting me like a wave. The cubs stirred weakly as I knelt and carefully laid them on a thick, folded blanket near the stove. They curled into each other instinctively, their small bodies seeking warmth. The mother bear hesitated at the threshold, her massive form silhouetted against the night. I turned to her, my voice low, steady. "Come on," I said. "It's safe." For a moment, she only stood there, nostrils flaring as she sniffed the air. Then, with slow, deliberate steps, she crossed the threshold, her claws clicking softly against the wooden floor. I exhaled, tension bleeding from my muscles. The door shut behind her, locking out the cold. I moved carefully, retrieving an old quilt from the chair and draping it over the cubs. Their shivering had lessened, their breathing slowing into something deeper, steadier. The mother bear settled a short distance away, her weary eyes fixed on them. The exhaustion in her body was unmistakable. But there was something else in her expression, something softer. A kind of quiet gratitude. "You've been through hell, haven't you?" I murmured. She let out a low rumble, her head lowering to the floor. The cabin was quiet, save for the crackle of the fire and the occasional rustle as the cubs shifted in their sleep. I sat on the floor, my back against the chair, watching them. 4 years. This cabin had been a place of solitude, a refuge from the life I had lost. But tonight, it felt different. Full. Alive. I hadn't planned on this. I had convinced myself that I had nothing left to give. But as I sat there, watching the mother bear curled protectively around her cubs, I realized something. Caring for them didn't feel like a burden. It felt like purpose. The night stretched on, the fire burning low. But I didn't move. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel alone. And for the first time in even longer, I didn't want to be. The days passed, and winter loosened its grip on the land. The mother bear regained her strength, and the cubs grew stronger, their playful energy filling the once silent cabin. But I knew the time was coming, the moment when they would have to return to the wild, to the life they were meant for. On a crisp morning, I led them to the edge of the forest. The mother bear turned to look at me one last time, her amber eyes holding something I could only describe as understanding. Then, with a final huff, she disappeared into the trees, her cubs bounding after her. I stood there, watching until they were gone, my heart heavy yet full. Sometimes, we think we're the ones saving others, but in the end, they save us, too. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to Life Stories for more unforgettable tales.